Long before numbered streets crossed the island, New York's oldest paths were shaped by fear, trade, survival, and power. These streets did not begin as streets. They began as trails pressed into the earth by native feet. They became lanes for carts. Later, they turned into boundaries for wealth, control, and exclusion. Each turn in the road carried a decision. Each narrowing path held a reason. To understand New York's old streets, one must forget the grid. The grid came late. It erased much. What survived did so by force, chance, or stubborn use. The story begins before the city had a name. When the Lenape people lived on Mannahatta, there were no streets. There were routes. These routes followed high ground. They avoided swamps. They led to water, food, and safety. One of these paths ran north from the southern tip of the island. Centuries later, it would become Broadway. This path mattered. It was not straight. It curved with the land. It followed ridges where feet stayed dry. It connected villages. It carried news. It carried warnings. When Dutch settlers arrived in 1624, they did not invent Broadway. They stepped onto it. This fact shaped the city forever. The Dutch needed order. They needed control. They also needed speed. So they kept the path. They widened it. They called it the Heerstraat, the gentleman's street. It became a place of movement and power. Other paths followed the same pattern. Pearl Street traced the shoreline. Water Street followed the edge where ships unloaded goods. These streets were not planned. They obeyed the harbor. The harbor ruled early New York. The first great challenge was chaos. New Amsterdam grew fast, too fast. Houses rose without plan. Lanes twisted between fences. Drainage failed. Waste ran in open gutters. Fires spread without mercy. Streets were narrow because land was precious. Every foot mattered. People complained. Merchants argued. Officials hesitated. The Dutch West India Company ruled the town. Profit mattered more than comfort. Streets existed to move goods, not to protect lives. This choice would cost the city dearly. In 1656, fire destroyed much of the settlement. Homes vanished. Warehouses burned. The streets failed their people. They trapped smoke. They blocked escape. Still, the streets stayed narrow. At the southern edge of the town stood a wall. Built in the 1650s, the wall ran from river to river. It was meant to stop attack. It was also meant to control movement. Beyond it lived people seen as outsiders. Free black families lived nearby. Native people passed through. Refugees settled close. The street beside the wall became Wall Street. At first, it was dirt. It held guards and weapons. It marked fear. The wall fell in the 1690s. The street remained. It kept its power. The wall shaped the city's thinking. It taught leaders that streets could divide. This lesson would return again and again. After the English took control in 1664, New Amsterdam became New York. The streets did not change overnight. The English inherited confusion. They also inherited tension. They tried to fix the mess. In the late 1600s, officials ordered streets widened. Property owners resisted. Land meant money. Giving up land meant loss. Court cases followed. Neighbors fought. Streets stayed crooked. One street became a symbol of this struggle. Maiden Lane ran east from Broadway. It began as a path beside a stream. The stream powered mills. The lane served workers. Over time, goldsmiths settled there. The name came from young women who worked nearby. The lane narrowed and widened without reason. It bent without warning. It reflected private deals, not public good. This was New York's pattern. Streets were shaped by power, not fairness. Wealthy landowners blocked changes. Poor areas stayed crowded. Alleyways formed where no one planned. These alleys hid poverty. They also hid crime. 5 Points grew from this neglect. At the meeting of several streets, low land collected water. The collect pond once provided clean water. By the late 1700s, it became a sewer. Tanneries dumped waste. Slaughterhouses drained blood. The pond filled with filth. Officials filled the pond with dirt. They built streets on top. The ground sank. Houses cracked. Water returned. The streets there trapped the poor. This was not an accident. The challenge deepened after independence. New York became a state capital for a short time. Trade grew. Ships arrived daily. Streets near the docks suffered most. Water Street flooded. Pearl Street smelled of decay. Disease spread through narrow lanes. Yellow fever struck in the 1790s. People fled north. The streets emptied. Fear traveled faster than carts. The old street system could not protect the city. Officials faced a truth they had avoided. The streets were killing people. The response came in 1811. Commissioners proposed a grid: straight streets, equal blocks, predictable movement, no memory, no curves. This plan ignored old streets. It erased hills. It cut through farms. It flattened history. The goal was control and growth. Broadway survived by chance and use. Other streets vanished. Native paths disappeared. Old lanes ended abruptly. The grid promised fairness. It delivered profit. Yet south of Houston Street, the old city remained. Its streets refused to align. They carried scars. This contrast told a story. One street held a quiet truth. Bowery came from the Dutch word for farm. It ran through open land. Over time, it became a road of taverns and theaters. Later, it became a place of poverty. The street changed, but its shape remained. It showed how use reshaped meaning. Streets were not neutral. They absorbed what happened on them. By the early 1800s, the old streets spoke of survival and neglect. The new grid promised order. The tension between them defined the city. People walked these streets without knowing their origins. Yet every curve came from a choice. Every narrow lane told of resistance. Every boundary reflected fear. The city carried these memories underfoot. They did not vanish. They waited. Before New York learned how to govern its people, it learned how to watch them from the street. The old streets of New York did more than move people. They enforced order. They displayed power. They delivered punishment in public view. In the early city, justice did not hide behind walls. It stood in the open, where streets forced people to look. This was done not by chance. It was done to teach fear. As the city grew through the late 1600s and early 1700s, leaders used streets as tools. Where a street led mattered. Where it ended mattered more. These choices shaped who felt safe and who did not. The streets carried law on their backs. At the heart of this system stood the gallows. Executions were held in public places. Early on, they took place near the fort at the southern tip of Manhattan. Later, they moved north as the city expanded. One common site stood near present-day Chambers Street. Crowds gathered. Vendors sold food. Children watched. Streets filled with sound. Officials believed this would prevent crime. They believed fear would keep order. The street became a classroom. Those who stood condemned walked through the city. Their path was chosen with care. It passed busy streets. It passed markets. It forced attention. The walk mattered as much as the act. The same streets carried prisons. The Bridewell stood near City Hall Park. Prisoners worked nearby. They broke stone. They cleaned streets. Their labor was meant to shame them. It was meant to warn others. People passed them daily. There was no escape from sight. The streets made punishment visible. This system fell hardest on the poor. Debtors filled the jails. If a man could not pay what he owed, he could lose his freedom. Merchants sued neighbors. Courts ruled quickly. Streets led men from shops to cells. Debtors' prison stood near present-day City Hall. Families visited through iron bars. Children learned early what failure looked like. The streets taught lessons without words. Wealth protected some. Poverty exposed others. Race shaped the use of streets. Enslaved Africans were brought through the harbor. They walked Pearl Street and Water Street in chains. Slave markets operated openly. One stood near Wall Street. Buyers inspected bodies in public. Sales happened in daylight. Streets carried human trade. This was not hidden. It was normal. Free black people faced constant danger. Laws restricted movement. Curfews applied. Patrols walked the streets at night. Anyone questioned could be seized. The street was never neutral. In 1712, tensions exploded. An uprising by enslaved Africans took place near Maiden Lane. Fires were set. Armed resistance followed. The response was swift and brutal. Authorities closed streets. Troops marched. Suspects were captured. Trials followed quickly. Executions were public. Some were burned alive. Others were broken on the wheel. The streets became scenes of terror. This was meant to send a message. That message shaped street life for decades. New laws followed. Enslaved people were banned from gathering. Night movement was restricted. Any group was suspect. Street corners became danger points. Fear lived in the open. Streets also carried political power. When protests arose, officials watched where crowds formed. Broad spaces worried them. Narrow streets trapped anger. In the 1730s, unrest over press freedom spread. John Peter Zenger stood trial. Supporters gathered near the courthouse. Pamphlets passed hand to hand. Streets carried ideas as well as bodies. Authorities learned that streets could not only punish, they could unite. This frightened them. Markets became another battleground. The Common Council regulated where goods could be sold. Street vendors were fined. Women selling produce faced arrest. Space meant money. Markets favored the connected. Others were pushed to alleys. This shaped survival. Street names revealed control. Names honored governors, kings, and investors. Queen Street, King Street, Duke Street. These names marked loyalty. After independence, names changed, yet the streets remained the same. Power changed hands. Control stayed. Disease returned as a silent enforcer. In the early 1740s and again in the 1790s, outbreaks struck. Streets filled with carts carrying the dead. Bells rang. Houses were marked. Quarantines closed roads. Guards blocked movement. The poor could not flee. Streets became borders. Fear ruled again. Riots followed hunger. When food prices rose, people gathered. They blocked streets. They overturned carts. Bakers were attacked. Soldiers responded. The streets absorbed violence. Each riot taught the city something. Crowds moved faster in narrow lanes. Barricades formed easily. Control was hard. This knowledge would shape future planning. By the late 1700s, leaders faced a truth. The old street system encouraged unrest. It hid crime. It trapped disease. It allowed resistance. Yet it also kept wealth protected. Changing it meant risk. They delayed. One street tells this story clearly. Broad Street ran wide by early standards. It allowed parades. It allowed troops. It allowed trade. Nearby streets stayed tight. This was designed through neglect. New York did not change its streets because it wanted to. It changed them because the streets began to destroy the city. Fire was the first teacher. In the early city, buildings stood close. Most were built of wood. Roofs touched. Lanes stayed narrow. Wind moved freely between walls. When fire started, it did not stop. The streets were meant to slow fire. They failed. In 1691, flames swept through lower Manhattan. Homes burned fast. People ran toward the harbor. Buckets passed hand to hand. Wells ran dry. The streets trapped heat. They trapped smoke. They trapped fear. Officials took notes. They promised reforms. Few followed. Fire returned again and again. In 1700, another blaze struck near Whitehall. Warehouses burned. Ships caught fire at dock. Trade stopped. Each fire revealed the same problem. Streets were too narrow. Buildings were too close. Access was poor. Still, landowners resisted change. Wider streets meant less private land. Stone buildings cost more. Profit came first. The city gambled with lives. Water became the second teacher. Fresh water was scarce. Wells served neighborhoods. Streams crossed streets. The collect pond stood north of the city. It once provided clean water. As industry grew, the pond suffered. Tanneries dumped waste. Slaughterhouses drained blood. Soap makers poured refuse. The water turned dark. The smell spread. Disease followed. People complained. Officials delayed. Streets around the pond became unlivable. Ground stayed wet. Mosquitoes bred. Houses sank. Cellars filled with water. Instead of cleaning the pond, the city chose speed. They filled it. Dirt, trash, and debris were dumped. Streets were laid on top. Buildings followed. The land could not hold them. Cracks appeared. Walls tilted. Water returned through the ground. This area became 5 Points. 5 Points was not planned as a slum. It was made one. Streets met at odd angles. Drainage failed. Sunlight struggled to reach the ground. Overcrowding followed. Immigrants arrived. Poor families settled. Rent stayed low. Conditions worsened. The streets trapped people. Officials blamed residents. They ignored cause. Fire found 5 Points easily. Buildings burned fast. Fire engines struggled to reach narrow lanes. Water pressure was weak. Each fire deepened poverty. The street layout ensured it. In 1776, disaster struck again. The Great Fire of New York burned through a quarter of the city. It began near Whitehall. Winds carried flames north. Streets filled with refugees. British occupation followed. Reconstruction stalled. The fire destroyed homes and records. It also destroyed faith. After the fire, some leaders argued for change. Stone construction gained support. Fire codes appeared, yet enforcement was weak. Streets stayed narrow in old areas. Money spoke louder than memory. Rain revealed another failure. Heavy storms flooded streets. Gutters overflowed. Waste mixed with water. Cholera and yellow fever followed water. In the 1790s, yellow fever returned. Streets emptied. Those with means fled north. The poor stayed. Carts carried bodies at dawn. The streets became silent. Quarantines blocked roads. Guards stopped movement. Commerce slowed. Fear ruled. Officials faced pressure. The streets had failed again. Out of this crisis came a turning point. City leaders accepted that water control mattered more than land profit. Plans formed to bring clean water from outside the city. These plans took decades. In the meantime, streets bore the burden. Fire departments changed. Volunteer companies formed. They competed for honor. Fights broke out at fires. Streets became battlegrounds. Hoses tangled. Access remained poor. Fire spread faster than response. One street told this story clearly. Exchange Place near Wall Street stayed narrow. Warehouses packed tightly. When fire came, loss followed. Merchants demanded protection. Slow change began. Streets started to widen in rebuilt areas. Stone replaced wood in key districts. Firewalls appeared. Yet these changes favored commercial zones. Residential areas lagged. Inequality deepened. The city learned another lesson. Old streets could not carry modern needs. Trade increased. Wagons grew heavier. Crowds thickened. Congestion became constant. Streets once meant for feet now served carts and animals. Conflict followed. Accidents rose. People were struck. Goods spilled. Animals panicked. Noise filled the air. Order slipped. This pressure fed the call for a new system. Straight streets, predictable blocks, clear access. The old streets stood in the way, yet they held memory. Some resisted. Churches stood on old lanes. Cemeteries blocked plans. Property rights slowed change. Compromise followed. The grid would begin north of the old city. Below it, the past would remain. This division shaped New York's future. Old streets became symbols of decay. New streets promised progress. Yet the old streets carried stories the new ones could not. They remembered fire. They remembered water. They remembered neglect. By the early 1800s, the city stood on unstable ground. Beneath its streets lay filled ponds, buried streams, and unmarked graves. The land held secrets. It would not stay quiet. For those who arrived by sea, the city began at the water's edge. Long before grand terminals existed, ships docked along the East River and Hudson shoreline. Passengers stepped onto uneven planks. They entered streets crowded with carts, barrels, and shouting men. Water Street was one of the first paths they walked. It smelled of salt, fish, and waste. Taverns lined the way. Boarding houses waited. Labor brokers watched arrivals with sharp eyes. The street made a promise. Work was near. Survival was possible. It also hid danger. Most immigrants arrived with little. They followed the streets inland, guided by language and rumor. Groups clustered where familiar voices lived. Streets became borders. A few blocks could decide safety. In the late 1700s and early 1800s, Irish immigrants began to arrive in larger numbers. They settled where rents were low. Streets near 5 Points drew them. These streets were already broken. Crowded buildings rose fast. Rooms were divided. Light disappeared. Air grew stale. Landlords collected rent. Repairs waited. The streets absorbed the strain. German immigrants followed. They settled farther east. Streets near the Bowery filled with shops, beer halls, and mutual aid groups. Language shaped movement. A person could walk a street and feel at home. One turn could change that. African Americans faced harsher limits. Free black families lived under constant watch. Streets near the Old Wall and north of the city held black communities. Movement was restricted. Curfews applied. Any gathering drew attention. Streets did not belong to them. Churches became anchors. African Methodist emical churches stood on quiet streets. These places offered safety. They also drew scrutiny. Authorities watched who entered and left. The street recorded everything. Street work defined survival. Men hauled goods. Women took in laundry. Children sold papers or begged. Each task tied to location. Markets allowed some access. Others pushed people away. Rules favored the established. Conflict followed proximity. In 5 Points, Irish and black residents lived close. Jobs were scarce. Tension grew. Streets became lines of defense. Fights broke out. Crowds formed. Police responded late. Blame fell on residents. The design of the streets was ignored. Nativist groups rose. They marched through immigrant streets. Drums sounded. Flags waved. These marches were meant to intimidate. They chose routes with care. Streets carried threat without violence. Riots erupted. In the early 1800s, clashes filled the streets. Windows broke, homes burned, churches were attacked. Police forces were small. Order was fragile. Streets ruled by numbers. Yet streets also carried hope. Mutual aid societies formed. They met in halls above shops. They organized funerals and aid. Parades marked holidays. Music filled the air. For a moment, the street belonged to the people. Street names changed meaning. The Bowery became a place of gathering. It held theaters and meeting halls. It also held crime. This mix defined immigrant life. Opportunity and danger shared space. Exile took quieter forms. City officials moved undesirable trades to certain streets. Slaughterhouses, tanneries, and dumps were placed near poor areas. Smells followed. Health suffered. Streets became warnings. Public health laws arrived slowly. Inspectors visited tenements. Fines were small. Conditions stayed. Reformers wrote reports. Change moved slow. The streets kept their burden. Burial revealed another truth. Graveyards filled quickly. Churches used nearby land. As space ran out, bodies were buried deeper. Streets passed over the dead. Later, remains would surface during construction. The past refused to stay buried. Schools followed settlement. Poor districts had fewer schools. Children worked instead. Streets raised children more than classrooms. Lessons were hard. By the mid-1800s, pressure built. Immigration increased. Old streets strained. The grid north of the city promised space. Parks were planned. Tenements followed. The old streets were left behind. This separation deepened exile. Newcomers lived where streets failed. Wealth moved north. The city learned to look away. Yet the old streets continued to shape identity. They taught cooperation. They taught resistance. They taught survival. Every generation learned from the street. By this time, the city faced a choice. Could it heal these streets, or would it erase them? New York did not erase its old streets all at once. It did so piece by piece, with laws, maps, and measured force. By the early 1800s, city leaders believed the old streets were a problem to be solved. They blamed them for disease, disorder, and resistance. The solution they favored was not repair, it was replacement. Maps became weapons. Surveyors walked the land north of the old city. They measured hills. They ignored streams. They drew straight lines. The commissioner's plan of 1111 changed everything. The plan imposed a grid of numbered streets and avenues. It promised speed and order. It promised fairness. It did not ask consent. Farms were cut apart. Homes were divided. Churches lost land. Cemeteries were crossed. Property owners protested. Courts overruled. The city chose efficiency. South of Houston Street, the grid stopped. The old streets remained. They were labeled obsolete. This divide shaped power. To make the grid real, the city used cutting and filling. Hills were leveled. Valleys were filled. Streams were buried. Rock was blasted. Streets appeared where none existed. The land was forced to obey. This violence against the land affected people. Black communities in Seneca Village stood in the path of progress. Their homes were seized. Churches were destroyed. The land became Central Park. Birkenhead Park in Birkenhead, England, was the key inspiration for Central Park in New York, particularly influencing its designer Frederick Law Olmsted with its English landscape design, naturalistic feel, and concept as a publicly accessible space for health and recreation during the Industrial Revolution. Their streets vanished. Their story was erased from maps. Elsewhere, old streets were severed. Some ended suddenly, others became short lanes. Their purpose vanished. Names faded. Memory weakened. Broadway survived because it was useful. Other streets were not so lucky. Old lanes lost connection. Businesses closed. Residents moved. The grid won. Infrastructure followed the grid. Water pipes ran straight. Sewers followed lines. Gas lamps favored new streets. Old areas lagged. This gap deepened inequality. Speculation thrived. Land near new streets rose in value. Investors grew rich. Tenements followed. Old streets became cheaper. Poverty settled there. Some resisted. Petitions were filed. Protests occurred. Courts sided with planners. The city spoke through maps. Policing changed with the streets. Straight lines allowed faster patrols. Control improved. Narrow lanes became targets. Crime was said to live there. This belief justified more force. Transportation reshaped streets. Horse-drawn streetcars ran on straight routes. Old streets were bypassed. Commerce followed rails. Old districts declined. The city gained power. It learned that it could reshape space to shape behavior. This lesson would return. Yet erasure had a cost. Buried streams flooded basements. Filled land sank. Old problems returned. The land remembered. People noticed. Cracks appeared in new buildings. Water pooled where streets were meant to drain. Engineers adjusted. The grid stayed. By mid-century, the old streets were relics. Some were romanticized. Others were condemned. Few were understood. The city moved forward. It believed the past was gone. It was wrong. Not all streets obeyed the plan. Some survived because the city could not fully silence them. By the middle of the 1800s, New York believed it had mastered its land. The grid stretched north. Straight lines ruled maps. Order seemed permanent. Yet beneath this order, older streets endured. They survived because people still needed them. Broadway remained the clearest example. It cut across the grid at an angle. It slowed traffic. It confused planners. Yet removing it was impossible. Too much life flowed through it. Shops depended on it. Theaters filled it. Crowds followed it. The city bent around Broadway. This survival revealed a truth. Use mattered more than design. Other streets survived quietly. St. Mark's Place followed an old farm road. It did not align with the grid. It remained because buildings already stood there. Change would cost too much, so it stayed. Greenwich Street followed the shoreline before land was filled. When the shoreline moved, the street did not. It ended up inland, crooked and stubborn. Its shape told of a harbor that no longer existed. These streets carried memory without words. People walked them without knowing why they curved. Yet the curve mattered. Old alleys survived as service lanes. They became places for deliveries, waste, and work unseen. They carried the hidden labor of the city. Some streets survived because removal risked collapse. Buried streams ran beneath them. Filled land shifted. Engineers avoided disturbance. Leaving the street was safer. The land protected its past. Cemeteries also saved streets. Church burial grounds blocked development. Streets bent around them. The dead shaped the living city. Markets preserved roots. Where trade persisted, streets endured. Merchants resisted relocation. Customers followed habit. Economics preserved memory. The poorest streets endured by neglect. The city invested elsewhere. Change cost money, so decay stayed. These streets aged without care. Writers and artists noticed. They walked old streets and wrote about contrast. They saw history in stone and angle. Their work preserved meaning. Tour guides began to speak of old paths. Curiosity grew. The city started to see value in what it once tried to erase. Yet this recognition came late. Many streets were already lost. What remained became precious. Old street names returned. Signs were restored. Maps marked them differently. Memory gained space. The city faced a new challenge: how to grow without destroying what survived. This question had no easy answer. By the late 1800s, reformers argued for preservation. They spoke of identity. They spoke of lessons. They were not always heard. The streets continued their quiet work. They guided feet. They shaped neighborhoods. They carried stories. One could stand on an old street and feel difference. Traffic slowed. Sound changed. The city breathed differently. These streets became classrooms. They taught that planning could not erase history fully. They taught that land remembers. As the century closed, New York stood changed. The grid ruled. Yet the old streets endured as threads. They connected past and present. New York never thanked its old streets, yet everything the city became passed through them. By the end of the 19th century, New York stood as a modern city in its own mind. The grid spread far north, industry roared, wealth concentrated, order seemed permanent. Yet beneath this confidence, the old streets still shaped daily life. They had done so for centuries. The old streets taught the city how power worked. They showed that control began with space. Who could gather? Who could move? Who could stay? From Wall Street to Maiden Lane, from the Bowery to Five Points, the city learned how to guide behavior without words. Streets became silent laws. They also revealed cost. Every narrow lane that trapped fire showed what neglect meant. Every flooded street proved that land could not be forced forever. Every outbreak that followed poor drainage carried a lesson paid in lives. The city learned slowly. Learning hurt. The old streets recorded injustice. They carried enslaved people to sale. They carried prisoners to punishment. They carried the poor to work that broke bodies. This history did not sit in books alone. It rested in stone and dirt. The streets remembered what people tried to forget. They also carried resistance. Crowds gathered where streets allowed it. Ideas moved hand to hand. Voices spread through lanes and markets. The street was never fully owned by power. This balance shaped the city's spirit. Immigrants learned the city through streets. They learned where to walk, where not to stop, where help lived. The streets taught language before schools did. They taught survival. Communities formed through shared paths. Neighbors met at corners. Children played in narrow spaces. Daily life built trust. The grid later broke some of this closeness. The old streets showed another way. The city tried to erase these lessons. It drew straight lines. It built fast. It valued speed. Yet problems returned. Flooding followed buried streams. Congestion followed growth. Isolation followed distance. The old streets had warned of these outcomes. Preservation arrived late. By the time value was seen, much was gone. What survived did so by chance and use. Yet these remnants mattered. They gave the city texture. They slowed movement. They invited attention. They reminded people that New York was older than its plans. Walking an old street changed perception. It forced awareness. It asked questions without asking. The old streets also carried humility. They showed that control was never complete, that land and people resist, that memory persists. In the end, New York became powerful by breaking its past. It became human by what remained. The hidden history of New York's old streets is not hidden because it is small. It is hidden because it lies beneath daily steps. Every curve tells of choice. Every narrow lane tells of struggle. Every surviving path tells of endurance. The streets do not speak, yet they teach. They teach that a city is not only built, it is lived, it is endured, it is remembered. This is what the old streets gave New York: a conscience underfoot, a history that cannot fully be erased, a reminder that progress carries responsibility. They ask nothing. They wait. They hold.